Daniel Truman was an older guy I used to work with. All things considered, he was a decent person, though he was one of those folks that had a story for about any occasion. Almost anything that anyone else may have experienced, he had a tale to top it. It could be quite annoying at times, but I don't believe he ever meant any harm. Perhaps he only craved being in the spotlight for a while. Maybe he had a few insecurities which could potentially have been momentarily eased by making himself the center of attention for a time. Regardless of his reasons, little to nobody actually believed his supposed recollections, as the majority of them sounded to be quite fictional. Oftentimes, he could successfully gain the respect of the new hires, or even some who had worked there for a while, who may not be all that familiar with him and his ways. Though he could tend to spin a well-crafted yarn, I would find my eyes rolling when he would take it upon himself to repeat the same tales over and over again, depending on his respective audience at the time. He was getting up in years, so it could not be denied that it was somewhat impressive that he would recite each one verbatim, whether he had only told it the day before or half a decade ago. Still, I highly doubted he had truly done everything from thwarting an attempted bank robbery with no more than his expertise in the martial arts to guide his actions, to witnessing an extraterrestrial ship crashing down near his old workplace, something he was forced to swear on a stack of Bibles he would never speak of. I can't say I didn't have a fondness for the old guy, though. Sure, his ways could quickly get under my skin when I was simply not in the mood for his endless rambling, but it would just sneak away when I wasn't feeling it. It wasn't hard to get away when things were quiet at work, but those were often times he would feel inspired to talk the most. More often than not, I would humor him with the mandatory one-word replies or the occasional oohs and ahs as his tales would reach their climax. I may even grant him an enthusiastic "holy shit" if I was in the mood to butter his popcorn a bit. He was harmless, really, and he would get a glint in his eye like a kid on Christmas morning when any of us would eat up the crap he was attempting to feed us. It wasn't until the day I returned to work after a 2-week sabbatical due to my father's passing when he told me a story I actually believed, as far-fetched as it was. On any normal day, he would practically perform his tales, darting his eyes between each person in the room, gesturing with his hands to increase the intensity, while dramatically pausing, in between raising and lowering the tone of his voice to fit the subject matter. But not this one. On this occasion, he didn't so much as glance in my direction while he spoke, in an almost monotone voice. Another unique component to this one was that he would actually pause when anyone else entered the office. Generally, he would backtrack to catch the new audience member up to speed, but it would seem this one was for me, and me alone. I wasn't exactly in the best mindset when I arrived back to work that day. Though my father had battled cancer for the better part of 3 years, it was still a shock when he finally lost the fight. I had always been close to my parents, so I spent the majority of those 14 days off the job caring for my mother, while taking little time to allow myself to face my own grief. She was slowly coming back to herself, but she had suffered almost as much as her husband over those past years, perhaps more so. In some ways, I think she was actually relieved that the fight was over, but she was still without her soulmate, regardless of the fact he would no longer have to suffer. My fellow employees from the previous shift were still in the office when I arrived. Each gave me their sympathies while making the token inquiries into how I was holding up and such, but I wanted little more than to be left alone. Though I appreciated the well wishes and condolences, I was not in a mood to talk about it. After they filtered out, leaving me alone with Truman, I just headed to my desk, keeping my head lowered in an attempt to convey how much I did not want to talk about things. For the first few hours, he respected my need for silence. It wasn't until I returned from a bathroom break that he began to speak. "I was just 12 when I lost my pop." I felt my neck tense up, instantly feeling anger pulse beneath my veins. Surely he doesn't feel the need to one-up me on something like this, I thought while keeping my back turned to the man in an effort to encourage him to cease his desire to get a win on something like this. "I know you're hurting, kid. Just tell me to shut the hell up if you don't want to hear me ramble on." There was something sincere in his voice, something compassionate and genuine I had never heard from him. I turned my chair around to face the man, only to see that he still had his back to me. Though I truly had no desire to hear some far-fetched yarn, perhaps concerning how his youthful frame was far too weak to successfully wrestle the alligator into submission as it chewed on his daddy's throat, his tone and mannerisms were far from the norm. I found myself growing quite curious as to what he had to say. "Ramble away," I said with a very false and forced chuckle. He returned an equally imitated laugh before he began to speak again. The story he shared with me that day stayed with me these past few years, a tale I would like to share with you now, should you have interest in hearing it. I will try to the best of my ability to recount the words as he spoke them, though I can't promise it'll be 100% to the letter. Still, I will not exaggerate, nor will I inflate his words to anything more grandiose than they were. The following is the last story that Daniel Truman ever shared with me. It was a small town I lived in with my folks back then, far smaller than this one. A little place called Rimrose Fall, a couple of 100 miles to the south of here. Wasn't nothing special, but I hadn't never been nowheres else when I was young. Mama had some ailments, ain't no need speaking about, but she'd have a need of going into the city every few weeks or so to see some of the better doctors than the one we had back home. My pappy had been promising to take me fishing for the last month or so, but it'd been hard to find the time between Mama and his work. We go from time to time, but it was a good drive to get to the lake he favored, so he'd always have to plan it out pretty good. I'd ask him sometimes why we couldn't just head up to Boulder Creek, being that it was just a couple of miles from where we lived, but he'd tell me we had no business going there. He said there were some local fishermen types that didn't take too kindly to others taking up their spot, though I hadn't ever seen no one else when we'd pass by in Pappy's truck. He wouldn't hear it though, made me swear I'd never even think about going out there, but I just didn't understand it at the time. You know how it is when you're that age, got everything figured out by then and can't nobody tell you otherwise. That Thursday, May 16th, 1968, Pop set it up where he was going to spend a whole day with me. He was going to take off work and said we'd go fishing and just have a good old time, just the two of us. He was even going to let me skip out on going to the schoolhouse, just so as we could get some father-son time in. I was plumb thrilled, and it was all I thought about for the 2 weeks that went by after he told me. Mama had seen her doctor the week before the 16th, so she should have been good while we was gone. Of course, her situation was a mite unpredictable, so when we got to that Thursday and she took a turn, Pappy didn't have no choice but to take her back to the city. He told me he was sorry, and I could tell he meant it, on account of how much he was looking forward to catching some fish too. Still, I can't say I wasn't none too thrilled about how it turned out. I didn't pitch a fit or nothing, but I didn't exactly put on an understanding face neither. Pop told me I didn't have to come with them to see the doctor, even though I'd already taken the school day off, but he promised we'd get that trip soon, just had to prioritize the important things. He could tell I was upset, but I didn't take no measures to convince him or Mama otherwise. I know it wasn't her fault, and I knew she was in bad shape when she took a turn, but I must have come off like a damn brat at the time. Pop looked plumb sad when he helped Mama to the truck, and I'm sure I could have made him feel better if I'd put some effort into it, but I didn't. Still feel bad for that to this day, but I know it was just a kid. Don't make it no better, though. I was still moping around the house a good hour after they took off. It had been some time since I last got to go fishing, so when I looked back at the tackle box we'd already set out by the front door, just about had my mind made up before it even registered. Boulder Creek was only a ways from the house, and if I could load up the box and fishing pole onto my bike, I could have been there and back before anyone was the wiser. I knew my folks weren't likely to get back until after sundown, so I could surely catch a few and still be back before they knew it. I reckon I was about as stubborn as a mule and hard-headed as an ox, so I didn't care that Pappy told me never to go out there. I figured he just didn't trust me enough to be able to get around all the wild brush and such without hurting myself, so he made some stuff up to keep me from going. I strapped the tackle box down to the back of my bike with some old belts I'd done growed out of and used some twine to tie around the pole, just sling it over my shoulder. Even strapped the bowie knife I'd got for Christmas to my belt, just in case I had to scare off some critters or something. It was a bit awkward to ride with the box and rod, but it wasn't nothing I couldn't deal with. The trail was rough and I damn near tripped over some of the lumpier parts, but before I knew it I was clearing the trees that surrounded the creek. I had never seen it up close before, only from the road up on the hill. It sure was purty. It was an almost perfect circle with thinner streams branching off here and there. In the middle there was a small mound of dirt with a giant rock sticking out of it. Suppose that's how they got the name Boulder Creek. Well, it's a mite unoriginal, given the island made of stone. The water looked as clear as if you just poured it from a jug, and I could see the fish zigging and zagging under the surface. Weren't no wild underbrush neither. I couldn't see no bottom to the lake, but the water was clear as far as my youthful eyes could see. Still, I wasn't the best swimmer, so I wasn't about to let myself get too close to it or nothing. I wasn't that curious to see how deep it went. While I got to unloading the tackle box, pulling the twine from the rod, and baiting the hook, I kept looking around for any sign of the locals Pop warned me about. Given that this was only a short ways from the house, I didn't see no reason why I wouldn't be considered a local, but I still didn't see no trace of anyone besides myself. The grass was overgrown in between patches of flat dirt and rocks, and it didn't look as if nobody had been out this way in weeks at least. Wasn't no bent blades or footprints. Hell, I couldn't even hear no sign of wildlife nearby except for the fish under the water. Weren't no crickets chirping or squirrels running up and down the trees. No birds flapping around in the woods or up in the sky above me. It was kind of peaceful, but a bit eerie too, everything being so quiet but me. Still, I went ahead with what I was there for and cast my line out into the creek. I could see the fish scatter as soon as my hook dropped in on them, so I just took a seat on the tackle box and stayed as still as a deer in headlights. I figured they'd gather back up once they felt it was nothing to be scared of. I was going to toss back whatever I caught anyways. Couldn't go bringing any back to the house when I was done. I didn't want Pop to know I'd disobeyed him. He wasn't never one to tan my hide unless I really had it coming, but I figured this would get me a good whooping on account of how he made me promise and all. My boots was getting all good and muddy too, so I figured I'd either clean them up when I got back, or just tell him I was playing around outside. Surely he'd have no reason to suspect otherwise. When I finally got my first bite, I swear I had to wrestle that sumbitch for a good 10 minutes straight. When I reeled her in, she had to be a good 6 pounds at least, maybe 1.5 feet long too. That might be no more than average for some, but it was the biggest sucker I'd ever seen at that age. After I let that one go, I didn't have as much luck. Biggest I reeled in after that was maybe 1 pound or 2, but I pulled in a good 5 or 6 from that lake before the sun started to sink. I knew I had to be getting back, but I wished I could have told Pappy how many I'd caught. I just knew if I could convince him to come out, we could have supper for a month. Still, I wasn't about to confess I did what he said not to. After I got the tackle box strapped back down and was tying the twine back to the fishing pole, I heard a whimpering coming from nearby. It had been so damn quiet I'd taken to keeping my breathing shallow and damn near tiptoeing around. You know how it is. Even if you got no reason to be quiet, you kinda act like it when there ain't no sounds other than you. I suppose that's why the sound damn near caused my heart to skip. Like I said, the grass was growed out pretty tall, and nothing had been cut down or maintained, so I couldn't see nothing from where the whimpering was coming from, even though it sounded like it was just some yards behind me. Being as curious as any kid that age, I had to see what was causing it. The closer I got, the more it sounded like another kid crying. I hadn't seen no one else out there the whole time I'd been there, but I hadn't looked around much neither. It scared me something awful to think there might have been someone hurt or passed out while I was having a good old time none the wiser. Could be they just started to come to, as I was getting ready to set off back home. All manner of things was going through my head the closer I got. It wasn't until I was right on where the whimpering was coming from that it just stopped. I swatted at the tall grass and was cutting my eyes this way and that, but weren't no sounds no more but me. Soon as I shrugged the whole thing off and made to head back to my bike, I noticed I couldn't lift my legs no more. I looked down, pushing the grass away so as I could see my feet, to see some sort of light shining from beneath me. Damn near pissed my pants when I saw the shadowy hands gripped around my shoes too. There must have been 5 or 6 of them, just tiny little hands gripping onto my feet and ankles. I hollered out as loud as I could while I was pulling at my legs, trying to break them free with the tight-gripped fingers, but I couldn't so much as yank my feet out of my shoes. I didn't stop screaming out with every bit of my lungs, even when the hands pulled me down into the other place. It didn't even feel like I went through grass and dirt, as much as there just wasn't no ground neath me for a minute. Knocked myself out cold when I hit the other ground that was under the one I was on before. As soon as I come to, I started hollering again. I didn't know if I was still asleep and dreaming, or if the giant shadow man who stood above me was real. He was bigger than anything I'd ever seen before, with bright red glowing eyes. That was the only thing I could make out on him, on account of the rest of him being no more than a shadow. I didn't see no sign of the little ones whose hands had pulled me through the top neither, just the big uns staring right at me. I was whimpering some, even after my yells gave out. The thing just looked down on me, tilting its head from one side to the other, but I don't think that he was the one making the other sounds I was hearing. It was some sort of clicking or snapping in a way. It was dark and kind of foggy all around me, but I could still make out a little. The walls almost looked as if they was wood, but the grains didn't flow like no wood I'd ever seen. It ain't easy to explain, but things wasn't shaped like they are here, you know? It looked like there was 4 walls, but also as if there was more. I couldn't see no sort of ceiling, and the ground I was laying on didn't feel like nothing natural, or nothing man-made neither. The clicking sounds was all around me, and no matter where I turned my head, I couldn't see where it was coming from, even though it sounded like it was right beside me. As soon as that shadow thing wrapped its hand around both my legs and lifted me up from the floor, my bladder couldn't hold back no more. That thing had to be 10 times my height at the time. I was kind of small for my age, but I hadn't never seen nothing this big. While I dangled in front of the shadow man's red eyes, I could make out more of his features. Oh, that ain't saying much. It had jet black skin and a sort of plain face, normal enough nose and mouth and all, but when it licked its lips, when it stared me down, I could see that even its tongue and teeth were black. It was like looking at a negative of a picture or something. On top of that, from up high where I was hanging, I could make out more of what stood under me. This'll likely sound even crazier than a 20-foot shadow man, but I swear to the good Lord they looked like man-sized insects or something. They was hidden behind that odd haze that made the one that held me look like nothing more than a shadow at first, so it was hard to focus my eyes on them. Could be there was nothing more than some menfolk in costumes, but they didn't move like no man I'd ever seen. Can't rightly say whether the one that held me or the giant bugs clicking at each other had me more unsettled, but I was sure I was done for nonetheless. It felt like the big un moved in slow motion almost, but it still hurt something awful when he slapped my body onto some sort of hard slab that had growed out of the ground before my eyes. Knocked the wind out of me too. When he stood back up, he looked like nothing more than a shadow again, but the insect things moved in closer to where I was laying. One of them was holding some sort of chains or straps or something, and the other had some odd-looking tools of some kind. One of them looked kind of like some pliers my pop had in the garage, and the other reminded me of the needles that the doc would stick in my mama's arms, but they wasn't made of no metal or glass I'd ever seen. I was shivering from my head to my toes and squalling as loud as I could. I was sure no one or nothing could hear me. I was screaming for help anyways. When I heard what sounded like a blade being sharpened from somewheres in the darkness, it dawned on me I still had my bowie knife strapped to my belt. Pappy had told me to be extra careful when he give it to me for Christmas, on account of the edge he ground into it. He shaved the hairs off his arm to show me how sharp it was. Sure enough, it left a shiny bald spot on his forearm in a second or two. As soon as one of them giant bugs made to pull a strap over my chest, I pulled my blade and swiped it across his arm, or leg, or whatever it was it held out. And whatever it was, I cut it short, and it let out a squeal like I had never heard. The other one came at me, and I stuck it with my blade too, carved it into whatever sort of flesh it had like a hot stick of butter. Both of them were hollering themselves now, and the big one came reaching for me. As soon as I dodged to the side, which weren't done too hard on account of how slow it moved, I heard a sort of muffled yell coming from outside of the room. It was hard to tell with it coming from what I supposed to be the outside world, but it sounded like someone was calling my name. I didn't see no doors or much of nothing else. I couldn't tell what direction the voice was coming from, so I just screamed out, I'm in here!" as loud as I could. I just kept hollering out the same words over and over while dodging the big guy and swatting at him with my bowie. As soon as I run the blade across the hand it stretched out, causing it to squeal out in another unsettling sort of sound, I saw something else that damn near turned my hair white. Maybe 10 feet or so above the spot I was laying on when I come to, I saw a normal enough, human-looking arm reaching through a sort of blue, glowing hole. The bug whose arm was a bit shorter now was helping the other one back up from the floor, so I knew I didn't have long. Without even thinking, I run for the hole, leapt for the hand as soon as I got within range, but I missed it, fell back onto the ground, damn near knocking the wind out of me again. I ain't sure if this'll make any sense. Hell, I ain't sure if none of this makes any kind of sense, but that clicking sound was a lot more aggravated than it was before. They was both coming at me, and the big one was coming back into view behind me too. The one I stuck wasn't moving fast, neither was the shadow thing, but that other one was charging pretty good. I jumped up again, but I couldn't get within a shout of the hand that was dangling down from elsewhere. I was gonna have to get a running start if I hoped to get close enough. With the big one on one side and the bugs on the other, I was running out of options. I just ran straight at the bug that was charging at me, swinging my blade from side to side, just hoping I could get it to back off. My britches were still soaked on account of my bladder giving out, but my tiny legs was scurrying like a mouse. As soon as my bowie made contact with the gut of the giant bug, it hit the ground, clutching at its middle. The other wasn't far behind, but it stopped in place while I was waving the knife around like a madman. I saw the big one reach for the arm that was poking through the hole, so I didn't have no more time to waste. I just run as fast as I could. When it got close enough, I jumped as high as my legs could take me. I grabbed onto the arm with both hands, let my knife hit the ground. I didn't mean to drop it, but I didn't want to risk not holding on tight enough, and I sure enough didn't want to poke it into the one that was trying to pull me out. Before I knew it, I was lying in the tall grass, panting and wheezing, worse than I did the first time I smoked a cigarette. While I lay there catching my breath, my pappy pulled me in close, grabbing me tight and not letting go. Soon as I realized it was his arm what poked through the doorway between this place and the other, I got scared he'd holler at me for not listening. Seemed all he cared about at the time was that I was alright. I was still shaking all over and crying my eyes red, and so was he, truth be told. I was saying I was sorry over and over, but he just held me tight, rubbing my back. I think he was trying to calm me down, but he was as tore up as I was. It was dark out by this point, so I didn't know how long I'd been down there, nor how long he might have been looking for me. I figured he got home and seen the tackle box gone. Likely didn't take him too long to put it together where I got off to. He was always a smart one, my pop. Once he got me calmed down, he patted me on the back and told me to go and get to my bike. I held up for a minute to wait for him, but he told me to get on home and he'd be there shortly. At first, I thought he was fixing to jump back down that hole and show them monsters a thing or two, but even as strong as my pappy was, I knew that'd be a bad idea. It wasn't until I got close to the edge of the creek when I looked back to see him just watching me with a smile on his face. It wasn't his normal smile, though. He still had tears dripping down, but there was something else in his face I couldn't quite figure out. We just stared at each other for a minute or two, before he just closed his eyes. As soon as it hit me what was happening, I charged back over to where he stood, rooted in place. I was maybe a few feet from him when he got pulled under. I dug around the ground where we'd sat hugging and crying, but it was only dirt and grass. Weren't no sign of any sort of hole or entrance to the other place. I still clawed at the ground till my fingernails bent back and my skin tore. I was hollering and wailing again, but there weren't no sign of him nor where he'd went. Seems whatever door he'd pulled me out of had closed as soon as he went through it. I rode back home faster than I knew I could. Maybe took me half the time to get back as I had to get out to the creek in the first place. I told my mama what happened and she was all kind of shook. She called the sheriff to come out, but I didn't know if he could help with something like this. He was an older feller, likely as old as I am now, but he didn't seem to think too kindly about going out to Boulder Creek. I was pitching a fit and Mama was causing a fuss too, so he finally gave in and headed up the trail with Deputy Mills. He was half the age of the sheriff, but he come off like his shit smelled purty. Looked down his nose at me and Mama as if we ain't have no right to call him. Still,
He didn't look none too thrilled about going up to the old creek neither, but the trail was wide enough for the car to get him close enough before they'd have to get out and go on foot the rest of the way. They wouldn't let me or Ma come with them on account of it being unsafe if a crime had been committed. I still wanted to go, but I couldn't leave Mama alone. She was all manner upset, and I was still tore up myself. I didn't think they would even know what to look for, but I didn't trust them to put a lot of work into looking. It was somewhere around midnight when they come back, but they didn't turn nothing up. I figured they wouldn't, but they had dried mud and dirt all under their fingernails and covered in their shirt and pants, so it looked as though they'd at least tried. More than I thought they would anyways. Both of them looked plumb rattled, and the deputy was white as a ghost. They had me fill out some paperwork, but it read like I was all kind of crazy when I read it back. The sheriff told me he'd get together a search party and do what they could to find Pop, but they never did turn nothing up. It was like he'd just vanished from this earth altogether. Suppose that's about the truth of it anyways. He warned me never to go up to Boulder Creek again, but I still would from time to time when my uncle would come to take Mama into the city to see the doc. I never found much of nothing neither, but every now and then, when I would just sit in the still and quiet of the place, I could swear I heard someone calling out somewhere as far away. Could have just been my mind playing tricks, though. I always told myself I'd go back up that way someday. It's my fault he got pulled down there in my place. I should have listened to him when he told me not to go there, but I was just too damn hard-headed to hear it. I know I ain't got no one to blame but myself for what happened, but Mama never blamed me, not once. She mourned from a Pop, but she still loved me with her whole heart until it give out. I still hold on to the hope that Pappy found my Bowie knife and hacked them things to bits before they could strap him down to that slab. I know I left him hurting a good bit, but I don't know about that biggin, nor whatever them little hands was neither. Could be he's still down there looking for a way out. Even if he would be pushing 90 by now, he was the toughest sumbitch I ever knew. He would never go down without taking him with him. I know this story likely sounds like the ramblings of a mad old man. Lord knows I've told you more than my fair share of wild ones over the years, and I ain't got no doubt that you know I was full of shit on most of them. You was always kind enough to play along when I'd spin the same old yarns time after time, and I can't thank you enough for that, kid. I was never the same after I lost my Pop, and I suppose I still got a screw or two loose, but you never made fun or showed me no sort of disrespect. You're a good kid, and I appreciate you humoring me this one last time. With all the crap I've fed to you over the years, I can't neither ask nor expect you to believe this one to be true, or hand to God. This may be the only truth I've ever told you. I ain't never seen no aliens, and I for damn sure couldn't fight off no armed robbers to save my life. But there are some things out there, kid. Some things we weren't never meant to see or meet. I can't rightly say where that creek sent me that day, nor where my poppy ended up, but to this day, I still wish I had answers to it all. I'm sure I ain't got too many years left ahead of me, and I sure as hell ain't getting no younger. I always wondered what I'd find if I just kept digging, though I don't think they was so much under the earth as under the world. Somewhere's under the surface of what we know to be. Maybe, though. Maybe I'll...
We were interrupted by the graveyard shift coming in, and I never had a chance to find out where that sentence would lead. Before he headed out for the night, Truman clapped me on the shoulder and shook my hand. He said he was truly sorry for my loss and told me to take care of myself. There was something more genuine in his voice than I had ever heard. Somehow, I think I knew this would be the last time I saw him. That one final story almost felt like a confession he needed to get off his chest, and I feel proud that he entrusted me those last words. He never handed in any notice, nor did he just outright quit the job he had held for the better part of 20 years. He just didn't come in the next day, nor any that followed. There was no obituary, no funeral, simply no sign of where he went, but I had a feeling I knew what his destination had been after he clocked out that one final time. His wife had died some years back, and his 2 sons moved away after college, so nobody knew much of anything about where Daniel Truman's future carried him. Some time back, I considered taking a trip to his old homestead to look for answers, but I could find absolutely no information on the town of Rimrose Fall, let alone the creek, which sat just away behind it. Maybe I just didn't look hard enough, or didn't entirely want to be tempted to follow up on where such a quest could lead me. There are some mysteries out there that are better left unsolved. Still, as completely out there as the story was, I believe every single word to this day. It could be that he just changed the name of the town to prevent me from temptation. Of course, it most certainly could have been no more than just another tall tale he told me that day. One last bizarre product of an imaginative mind. Just one more for the road. But I don't think so. Not this one. I like to camp and fish from time to time, but I never retreat to the more secluded spots of the world anymore. Maybe I am just a gullible idiot, or a little intimidated by the possibilities. But maybe not. Perhaps we are little more than fish in a barrel to those who dwell beneath, should we be unfortunate enough to cross into their territory. I did purchase a fairly hefty Bowie knife for when I do take those trips out into the woods. That along with my pistol. It never hurts to be prepared after all. I truly hope that Daniel Truman is still out there somewhere, bending the ear of many who may have grown as tired of his tales as I had at one time. For most I have met over the years, I would wish them well and hope they find what they are looking for in life. But not Truman. I hate to think what he may have found, if he did go in search of it.